I make no secret of the fact that I'm a huge fan of garter stitch, but when you are knitting a simple solid coloured blanket like this, just one huge swathe of garter stitch doesn't really work in the way that I would like it to. And that is how Casper, the blanket, was born. I wanted to have a blanket that I could knit, that the bulk of it was still garter stitch, but it had a little bit of texture interest that wasn't going to make for an overly complex pattern repeat. Casper is an 8-row repeat, and 7 of those 8 rows are garter stitch, so you are working one row differently that produces these really cute little stockinette rectangles, and it just adds a little bit of texture to what otherwise could be quite a plain and simple blanket. It's not reversible, so the rear of the blanket does not look the same, but the rear looks pretty much just like garter stitch. You just get slightly different shadow where you have worked the stockinette on the other side. To knit this blanket, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. That is a 3-weight yarn for those of you over in the States. You are also going to need some circular needles, about 80 to 120 centimeters is perfect. This blanket is too wide to be worked on straight needles. You're going to need some embroidery scissors, and you're going to need 2 stitch markers that help you mark where your border section is and where your middle textured pattern is. So without further ado, let's jump right in and start knitting this blanket. When you are casting on for a blanket that has an inbuilt border like this one, it's often really handy to treat the stitches that you cast on for the border separately to the actual main pattern repeat. So the pattern repeat for this blanket is 12 plus 6, so you want to cast on in multiples of 12 and then add another 6 stitches, and then for the side borders you want to add a total of 18 stitches. That is 9 stitches for each side. And if you want to make a blanket like mine, which is 60 by 80 centimeters, you'll need to cast on a total of 132 stitches. That includes your border stitches, so it is a complete total of 132. But if you want to make different widths, you just need to use that multiple of 12 plus 6 to cast on the number of stitches that you want. I like to use the long tail cast on method for all of my blankets, but if you have a method that you prefer, then go ahead and use that. It really doesn't matter what cast on method you use. I'm just going to cast on a small sample today, but as I said, for the blanket that you saw in the intro, you will need to cast on 132. The first part of the blanket that we work after we've cast on our stitches is that bottom garter stitch edging, and the first 16 rows is working that bottom garter stitch edging, and every row is the same, and you work those rows as follows. You want to go ahead and knit every single stitch until the final stitch, so knit along until you have 1 stitch left on your left hand needle. Instead of knitting this final stitch to get our nice little braided edge up the long edges of our blanket, we want to slip the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and the way to do that is to bring your yarn to your front of your work, pop your right hand needle into the stitch as if to purl, and then slip it off your left hand needle and then pull the yarn from the back round to the front, and the tail should be sat at the front of your work. And you want to go ahead and repeat that for 15 more rows until you've worked a total of 16 rows. So this was row 1, and now you would go away and work rows 2 to 16 in exactly the same way. After 16 rows, you should have a piece of work that looks a little bit like this. I like this smooth edge of the cast on to be the right side of the work, so when you look at the right side, which is just after you've finished row 16, you should have this smooth cast on edge and then 8 garter ridges in total, and that will mark the fact that you have knitted 16 rows. Then we are going to move on to work 1 setup row, and then we'll jump into our 8-row repeat. The setup row is just to add the stitch markers, and then it makes it easier to explain the 8-row repeat and to finish on a row that leaves you in the right place to start your top border. So your setup row is worked as follows. You want to knit the first 9 stitches. Then you want to grab your first stitch marker and pop it onto your right hand needle. That just marks where your side border is. Then you want to purl the next 6 stitches. And then you want to repeat knit 6, purl 6 until there are 9 stitches left on your left hand needle, and that should come at the end of a purl 6. So you want to work knit 6, purl 6 all the way along until you have 9 stitches left on your left hand needle, and that should come after a purl 6. I've got 9 stitches left on my left hand needle now, so I'm going to grab my second stitch marker and pop it onto my right hand needle, and then I'm going to knit the next 8 stitches. Just like we did with the bottom garter stitch border, the last stitch we're not going to knit, we're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And that is your setup row complete. You've got your stitch markers in place and you've worked your first textured row. As I mentioned in the intro, the bulk of this blanket is actually just garter stitch. It's an 8-row repeat, so the first 7 rows of that 8-row repeat are garter stitch. So that means you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of the final one, and that final stitch you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front in exactly the same way as you worked for this border. So now what you want to do is go away and knit 7 rows, and that should leave you just about to start a wrong side row. So knit all the way across, slip your markers as you come to them, and then slip that last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front for a total of 7 rows. Row 8 is the row that is going to add these little textured rectangles, and it's the one that gives this blanket a little bit more interest than if you were just knitting it in plain garter stitch. So after 7 rows you should have 3 garter ridges on the front. They're easy to count in between these stockinette rectangles, and you should be just about to start a wrong side row. So row 8 is always a wrong side row. We start row 8 by knitting the 9 stitches before the stitch marker. Slip the stitch marker over from the left to the right needle, and then you want to purl the next 6 stitches. Then you want to work knit 6, purl 6, and repeat those 12 stitches until you hit the next marker. And if you've counted your stitches correctly, that should come after a purl 6. So that's knit 6, purl 6 all the way along until you hit your next marker. Slip the marker from the left needle to the right needle as you come to it, and then knit the next 8 stitches. Don't forget that instead of knitting the last stitch, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's our 8-row repeat for the main body of the blanket. It's really nice and easy, but I will just recap it for you one more time so that you've really got it down in your head before you go away and knit this. Rows 1 to 7, you want to knit every single stitch except the last one. The last stitch of each row you are going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front, and you want to remember to slip those stitch markers over as you come across them. But essentially it's just 7 rows of garter stitch with the exception of that final stitch that you're going to slip purlwise with the yarn in front. Just a reminder that 7 rows will leave you with 3 garter ridges above your stockinette section, and you should be just about to start a wrong side row. So your row 7 will have been a right side row. Row 8 is the row that adds your texture into this pattern, and you want to start by knitting the first 9 stitches, and that will take you up to your stitch marker. slip the stitch marker over from your left needle to your right needle as you come to it, and then purl the next 6 stitches. Then you want to repeat knit 6, purl 6 all the way across until you hit your next stitch marker, and if you have counted your stitches correctly, that should come after a purl 6. So the last thing you work before your stitch marker should be a purl 6. Slip that second marker over as you come to it, and then knit the 8 stitches after that marker. And then your final stitch you are not going to knit, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front so that you get that nice braided edging. You would now go away and repeat rows 1 to 8 as many times as you feel that you need to do until your project is the size that you want it. If you're wanting to replicate my blanket and you've cast on the same amount of stitches that I did, then I repeated rows 1 to 8 a total of 34 times. So that is including the first 8 rows. So in total, I worked rows 1 to 8 34 times. That's just a rough guide. You might feel that your tension needs slightly more or slightly less than that, but that should give you hopefully a really good idea as to how many rows that you are going to need to knit. After you have finished a final row 8 and you are ready to finish off your blanket, we need to now go ahead and knit the top garter stitch border so that we are matching at the top and bottom. You want to make sure that you start that border after you have just completed a row 8. So you want to have the right side of your work facing you, and you should have just worked your texture row. The top garter stitch border is really nice and easy to knit. It's basically the same as we did for our first row. So you want to start off by knitting 16 rows of garter stitch. That should take you back to a right side row and should leave you with 8 garter ridges on the front of your work. So go ahead, go away and knit 16 rows of garter stitch. Don't forget that on that final stitch of each row, you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And then also on this first row that we knit, we can remove the stitch markers as we come to them because you don't need to mark your side borders anymore. So that's 16 rows of knitting with the final stitch of each row slipped purlwise with the yarn in front. If you go ahead and work those rows, I will go away and do the same, and then I'll come back and show you how we work the cast off and finish this project off. The final step of our blanket is to cast off our work and get this thing off the needles so that we have a finished piece of knitting. I like to use a basic knitted cast off for all my blankets. I find it's just the easiest and neatest way of casting off. I'm going to go over it really briefly in this video. I do have a more in-depth video that I'll link up at the top now so that you can go ahead and watch it if you need a little bit more detail. But the way that we want to cast off is by knitting 2 stitches. Make sure you don't knit them too tight. You want them to be fairly nice and even in their tension. Then once you've knitted 2 stitches, you want to grab the right hand side stitch going in from left to right with your needle, pick it up and lift it over the second stitch that you knitted and drop it off your needle. So you've gone from 2 stitches to 1, and that's the way that we work all the way along the row. So then we knit 1 more stitch and then lift the right hand stitch over the stitch we've just knitted and off our needles. And you want to repeat that process all the way along until you have cast off all the stitches, and the only thing that you have left is 1 solitary loop on your right hand needle. If at any point you have more than 2 stitches on that right hand needle, then you've gone wrong and you need to backtrack a little bit, because the golden rule of this cast off is that you should never have more than 2 stitches on your right hand needle. So you just want to work that process all the way along to the end of the row, and when you have 1 stitch left on your right hand needle, you can break your yarn and I'll show you what to do next. When you've just got this final stitch left on your needles and you have broken your yarn, making sure to leave a long enough tail to sew in those ends when you're done, you can finish things off by pulling this loop and making it bigger. and then you can get rid of your knitting needles. We don't need those anymore. And then I like to just thread the tail through that stitch and then pull gently to tighten, just to secure that last stitch off, and then you would go ahead and sew in your ends in your preferred way. And there we go. That's how you can knit yourself a Casper blanket. If you're the kind of person that likes to have written instructions to follow along with, then I have left those on my blog for you, and I will link that down in the description below. And what I'll also do, if you're not quite ready to go away and start knitting, then I'm going to link another video up here that I think you will also enjoy. That's all from me for today, and I will see you again for another video soon. Bye!